Miji Čorak Slavenskoj was my mother. This is her story. For most of my life, she made a living teaching ballet. But she lived in the past when she had been a celebrated ballerina. She didn't want to be forgotten. She spent over 20 years writing her memoirs. Shortly before she died, I promised that I would tell her story. That promise has brought me here, but I'm getting ahead of myself. As soon as I made the promise, I realized that I really didn't know much about her life in her glory days. You see, I didn't really believe that the life of a ballerina mattered. Her memoirs sat on her desk. I opened them for the first time. And that's when this journey began.
I was born in the beautiful land of Croatia on February 20, 1916. My mother told me that we came from the aristocracy. She had grown up in wealth during the days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But her family lost its fortune and she married my father, a modest pharmacist.
I was premature. Because I was so thin and wouldn't eat and so on, the doctor suggested some kind of gymnastics. And my mother was struck with ballet, so she talked my father into it, telling him, well, why not ballet? She'll also become graceful.
And Mia always said she never would have been a dancer if her mother hadn't beaten her into it. Now, I don't know if that's true, because really her whole being was in being the artist.
When Margarita Froman, a former Bolshoi ballerina who had also danced with Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, formed Zagreb's first national ballet, Hedda immediately enrolled my mother in Froman's school. Froman saw something in the young girl and took her under her wing.
I made my debut in a dance called La Sylphide. Mother explained to me that sylphs were spirits that live in the air. That was all I needed. When I floated out onto the stage, I became that tiny sylph. I did not pretend. Then the thunder came and I was frightened by its roar. Ivo Rajic, Croatia's most famous actor, shouted over the applause that I was an angel sent from heaven. He jumped onto the stage, lifted me on his shoulders, and carried me out through the streets as my parents and the crowds followed behind.
Naša ballerina, ona je.
I was 6 years old.
She had her own evening at 12. In Split and after that in Zagreb. I svi su je slavili. Svi su rekli ona je sjajna. To je bilo pitanje umjetnosti.
I was cocky. Zagreb was a very Catholic, very conservative city. But I was given special dispensation to be as unconventional as I pleased. When my Uncle Walter wrote from America that all women there wore pants, I immediately adopted this form of attire. When he sent a whaler slicker, hat and pipe, I could be seen in the streets of Zagreb, even on the hottest summer days, smoking my pipe and walking my rooster. In the real world, I was like a fish out of water. I couldn't breathe. Fantasy was my element. As long as I had fantasy, I was free. Mother saved all year from father's meager salary. When I was 11, our yearly ritual began of spending summers in Vienna and Paris to study and see the latest developments in dance.
Mia was lucky to be born in the first quarter of the century. There were extravagant things going on in dance. Both the ballet and modern dance were engaged in radical experimentation. She certainly was aware of this.
I went to Vienna to study modern dance because I became fascinated with it. Once the Zagreb theater brought Mary Wigman and Harold Kreutzberg to perform. I was hypnotized.
Modern dance had not acquired a name. It was still an exploratory adventure that was going on in Germany.
When the theater brought ballerinas from the Bolshoi, I found their performances old-fashioned and trite. I began to realize that one could express an idea through movement in a different way.
Mia got some sense that the true spirit of modern dance was personal revelation through personal movement. She never thought of herself as being a ballet dancer as separate from being a modern dancer. Her idea of being a dancer was inclusive.
My father was a kind, gentle, hard-working man. He loved Croatia. He had hoped that the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I would at last bring Croatia its independence. It didn't. The Serbian Prince Regent Alexander, who became our king, drained Croatia of its resources.
There was a lot of political unrest in the country.
Croatians wanted a nation. For centuries, they had lived under foreign rulers. Their own national ballet was formed and directed by a Russian émigré ballerina, Margarita Froman. Now they wanted their own ballerina in their own theater.
The Croat press was clamoring to oust Margarita as prima ballerina and have me replace her. Croats had had enough. Margarita the Russian had to leave. I made my debut as prima ballerina on September 9, 1934. My reign lasted only 1 year. The theater management only wanted operettas and old ballets, but I wanted to bring Zagreb all that was new. So I wrote an open letter to the management which was published in the press. Why does our ballet not keep step with the times? Time moves on, and our ballet still dreams the naive dreams of fairies, wizards, swans, dolls, and the like. Why do we not look into the rich post-war dance that is offering modern ideas? Kurt uses a revelatory green table. Nijinsky's brilliantly choreographed Le Noce, which is also a social commentary. Time moves on, and our ballet still dreams its naive dreams.
In my mother's mind, her article was about art. But in 1930s Yugoslavia, the line between art and politics blurred. Her contract as prima ballerina was not renewed.
Dakle, nije produžen ugovor, o tome smo pričali, nije produžen ugovor, ona nije mogla plesati, samo honorarno, i onda je iznajmila dvoranu za svoje novce i u siječnju 1935. dala je veče za Anu Pavlovu, posvećeno 5. obljetnici smrti Ane Pavlove. To je bilo njezino zadnje last evening. I njezino zadnje veče, nakon kojeg se publika digla, ljeskala, larmala, divljala.
The papers describe the uproar. After the performance, the audience went wild. They refused to leave the theater, shouting from their seats that they wanted her contract renewed.
Why can't our Croatian ballerina dance?
Našu balerinu, našu Miju.
I to su bile prave demonstracije. Prave demonstracije nakon kojih je uprava kazališta zabranila mi nastupe.
So she left Croatia and she never came back.
No.
Never danced again on the stage.
No.
Never.
Mother and I left our homeland, our roots, and began our wanderings. It had been less than a year since we left Croatia. We went to Berlin, where Mother entered me secretly into the 1936 Berlin Dance Olympics, afraid that if the monarchy found out, they would forbid me from competing. To everyone's surprise except Mother's and mine, I won. Yet I was still not welcome on the stages of my homeland. So with only 500 francs and a letter of introduction from a German critic to the impresario Arnold Meckel, Mother and I came to Paris.
Arnold Meckel had a knack for uncovering new talent. He had discovered André Segovia and the famous Spanish dancer, La Argentina.
I auditioned for Meckel at Salle Pleyel. It was the only audition I ever gave. When I returned to his office, after changing, he and Mother were leaning over his desk. On the desk was a large poster-type paper. Across it he wrote, Slavenska.
In 6 short months, Meckel made my mother a star. And it wasn't long before the famed French film director Jean-Benoît Lévy discovered her.
Oh, mais non, mais beaucoup plus vite. Vite comme le diable, s'il vous plaît.
In the window of a store, Jean-Benoît Lévy saw my picture and called Meckel and said, "This is the woman I want to play Nathalie Karin."
I saw La Mort de Cygne and was seduced. I swallowed it whole hog. It was all a magical world that I found very attractive. The images from the film stayed in the back of my mind. And the images of Miji Slavenska, always backlit with a halo on her golden braids. I went around for several months looking for women who had similar halos.
It was in the same building as Martha Graham's studio, and I would go between classes and see it again and again and again. And it really made history, and it really catapulted her.
Everything was coming up roses for Hedda and Mia. Then, in 1938, Meckel died without warning.
And I was left without management and absolutely scared to death. Next morning at 9 o'clock, Ballerus de Monte Carlo called me. I signed blindly a 3-year contract.
A year after my mother joined the Ballerus de Monte Carlo, World War II began to consume Europe. She, along with the company, escaped on the Rotterdam, headed for an opening season in New York.
When the Rotterdam docked, we ran straight from the pier to the Metropolitan Opera House where the Ballet Russe was opening that evening.
The Ballet Russe caused an excitement. You always knew you were going to see a good show.
The sensation of the curtain going up at the Met, and suddenly there was a blast of dazzling light and color and gorgeous people moving gorgeously. And it was like eating sugar.
The Ballet Russe played long seasons in New York, and once they became clear that they couldn't go back to Europe, New York became their home. But they spent much of their lives on the road.
When they got here, they discovered that the American audiences wouldn't have appreciated high art in the ballet had they been able to see it. They just were a very young audience here in the 1930s and 40s. It's amazing that these emigre folks pretty quickly figured out what Americans wanted. They wanted glamour.
I remember when we had arrived in New York Harbor for the 1938 tour a year earlier. The photographers lined us up and insisted on cheesecake. When one of them came up to me and lifted my skirt, I slapped him. I was used to being treated with respect, even awe, in Zagreb, Berlin, Paris. There I was an artist. Here I was a pin-up girl.
The mastermind behind the commercial success of the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo was Saul Hurok. And he was someone who fell in love with ballet at an early age. He saw Anna Pavlova dance and he decided ballet was it. But he was not a highbrow. Hurok was the one who sold the Ballet Russe as something exotic, glamorous, and sophisticated.
Of the ballerinas, Hurok promoted me as the sex symbol, a woman men would die for. That I was a ballerina was only incidental.
Step right up, ladies and gentlemen. Miji Slavenska, one of the most noted ballerinas in the world, is here at the New York World's Fair as she perches airily on the hood of the 1941 Super Deluxe V8 Ford, indicating her idea of streamlining in the car salon of the Ford Motor Pavilion. The great Slavenska visited that building during the...
As the season progressed, my mother began to think that having signed with the Ballet Russe might well have ruined her career.
I mainly sat through the whole Metropolitan season in the audience watching, except for the opening night where they had me do Capriccio Espagnol in a black wig.
After 3 or 4 weeks, she could sense what was going on. And I mean, come to class, put the toe shoes on, and then what? Nothing.
I couldn't understand why I wasn't dancing opening nights and star roles like Giselle in Swan Lake. I was a star. I had fans. My movie was playing all over town. But when I danced, I only danced the lesser roles like Scheherazade or Gaité.
If you're a ballerina, you want to dance the big roles. But what were the big roles around 1940? These companies did not dance full-length ballets. They danced shortened versions of some of these ballets. Part of the problem was that you had an awful lot of prima ballerinas and relatively few real ballets to dance. So there was a lot of competition.
There were other ballerinas who had more clout and...
They had managers negotiate.
Yes, yeah. People fighting for them. She had only her mother.
First of all, I could never rehearse. We're leaving on a Saturday and I'm reading the next day's program, and of course the matinee is Coppelia with Slavenska. So I went to the regisseur and I said, well, I can't do it. I have to have a rehearsal. He says, we can't give you a rehearsal. If you don't want to do it, I'm quite sure Madame Danilova will be glad to. So I went into my very first Coppelia without a single rehearsal, a 3-act full-length ballet.
Whenever my mother did dance, she thrilled audiences. But the politics of a large company with many stars vying for the top roles and venues took its toll.
The Ballet Russe in America was at sea. The management was very erratic, very disorganized. Casting was always uncertain.
After a while, I began to rebel. Čorak wanted glamour. I gave it to him, and all that went with it.
You know, we went down to South America. We're on the ship. Your grandma came and said, where's Mia? I said, Mia? I haven't seen Mia either. Where is she? We're all running over the boat. Well, by this time, we are a good 10 feet away from the pier. And up comes a beautiful white car with a beautiful lady and this very handsome man and waving. And it's Mia. And Čorak's on the boat. Well, we can't leave her. It costs something like $20,000 to get the boat back in. And Mia got out of the car waving to everybody, and you know the entire company booed. They all booed at her. It didn't make any difference at all. Oh, that was something.
When my contract expired, much to my surprise, Čorak asked me to stay on. But I couldn't leave the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo fast enough.
She was determined to make her way, and it was going to be her way. And it was her way. As Danilova would say, like it or not, I am ballerina.
I had waited anxiously for the war to end so I could bring my father to America. But right after the war, I received a letter from my cousin telling me that my father had died. I had lost my father. I had lost Croatia. On September 12, 1947, I became an American.
So we started into rehearsal, and then we found out that Miji Slavenska was going to be the star. And then one day, with lots of up and down the stairs, and Madame Slavenska arrives, and we go, ah. She had a way, you know, she was, I am here. She wore a coronet of braids, which we'd never seen before. You're supposed to part your hair in the middle and a bun. You're supposed to have a head that big with a long skinny neck. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do. Oh, really? I mean, the hair was up. The sculpture curls came here. The braid was, the coronet was like this. And then the tiara on top of that. Hey, no wonder they stood up when she walked out on the stage.
Once, my mother told me that she had feared she would have the same fate as Marilyn Monroe. When I asked her if it was my father who had saved her, she laughed and said, "No, not your father. Dance."
I had given up on all men. Then I met Kurt. He was the most strikingly handsome man I had ever seen.
My father had been part of the Austrian resistance to fascism and had escaped in 1938, just as Hitler was marching into Vienna. He managed to get to the United States, where, ironically, he made a living as a bit actor playing Nazis in Hollywood movies.
We had little in common. His world was politics. The only music he liked was Strauss, and he certainly had never heard of Miji Slavenska. I hated politics and lived only for dance. So naturally, we fell madly in love. After our first night together, he moved in with me and Mother. Mother took an instant dislike to him. His only redeeming quality in her eyes was that he gave her Maria. She beamed whenever she looked at her grandchild. When I took my company back out on the road, Mother took on the role of nanny, and I was free to pursue my calling.
I was always trying to get my mother's attention as a child. Dance seemed to be the way into her heart. So I danced, and I danced, but she gently discouraged me. Later she said she didn't want me to live such a hard life. For a long time I saw dance as my rival, and I resented it. But I think I understand now. It was a hard life. Dance was my mother's passion, but it became our livelihood. My father managed her career, and she was our breadwinner. Making a living consumed all of her energy. While my friends saw little of their fathers, I was always waiting for my mother.
The Ballet Russe was a distant memory when Anton Dolan, the artistic director at the time, invited me to return. I was reluctant, but Anton promised me that this time things would be different.
She came back really as a ballerina. Mia had arrived I mean, guess is one thing, but when she started having to do the stuff, you know, or the Black Swan pas de deux, then you saw what she could do, which hitherto has never been seen.
This was a great ballerina, an icon.
She was a beautiful dancer. She was a top ballerina along with Danilova, Slavenska.
The little that I saw of her left an indelible impression, almost more so than any other dancer. She had weight, she had expansiveness, she conveyed a kind of kinetic energy that was not tension or thrust or force, it was just freed energy. And I'd never seen a dancer like that. Her approach to classicism was quite different from anybody else's at the time. Mia was glamorous, but her performance was never kitsch. She was willing to give up all the manner of the other ballerinas of her time and be just a purist. That spatialness and the breadth of her movement became my ideal of what classicism is. And I looked for it and I found it sometimes, but no one has ever achieved it quite the way she did.
After years of being denied opening nights, I found myself on the stage of the Old Met at the gala opening of Ballet Russe's 10th anniversary season, flanked by Danilova, Markova, and Kravsovska. I had at last taken my place.
And that was such a thrill because in the course of the evening, you got to see pas de quatre. And then later on, she came on and knocked them dead with the Black Swan. People went crazy because she did the complete 32 fouettes and did them on a dime. She was the Paganini of all the ballerinas.
I formed the Slavenska Franklin Ballet. I asked Mr. Franklin to come in with me.
At that stage of the game, I wanted out from the Ballet Russe. I thought, well, why not? We asked Shora to come in.
So I decided that she should become our guest star.
And it was with a great hope that we thought, well, we can make this. There's nothing in the United States at the moment quite like this.
You had ballet theater, Ballet Russe, and something like this Slavenska Franklin was just wonderful. The first professional job I'd ever had that actually had a salary, a contract, and a touring schedule that they gave you.
court figured out that travel by bus was cheaper than train, so we bought an 18-seater and named it Oscar.
Providence, Rhode Island, Albany, New York, Syracuse, New York, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Altoona, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Huntington, Charleston, Columbia, Akron, Wheeling, Cleveland, Chicago, Milwaukee, Chicago again.
And then 2 more pages.
Everybody was on the bus. Mia was on the bus, Freddie was on the bus, Shura was on the bus.
We performed in many small towns that had never had a ballet company visit them before, and we were the first glimpse they had of its magic.
The people that were there loved it, and we had good press.
It was hard on us, but it was rewarding to realize that, all in all, we were doing something progressive.
This company, that certainly was her idea. She was a smart woman. In an era when women were not in positions of power, she was the creative director, and Freddie was her right-hand man. He was the one that kept the glue that kept everybody happy and humming.
He was always up and, hello, ducks, here we go, you know.
And it was a very mixed program. There was enough to satisfy everybody. But the big star power piece was Streetcar.
She said, I have a marvelous idea for a ballet. I said, well, what is it? So she said, Streetcar named Desire. And then, you know, she wanted Tudor. And Tudor said yes. And then he said no, right before the day before rehearsal. And I had worked with Valerie. And I said, listen, Mia, there's Valerie. And I called Valerie. I said, Valerie, we're going to do Streetcar named Desire. And she said, I thought it'd be lovely if you'd come and do the choreography. She said, what? Never. When do we start?
I read that Streetcar was coming, and it was so different than my other ballet experiences. It was eye-opening. It was stunning.
It was the talk of the ballet world.
Frederick Franklin, he was terrific. He brought to it a kind of pantherine intensity. He was taut, he was tense, and the two of them together had a chemistry that it was compelling to watch.
Her Blanche gave you the personal tragedy of a woman who is unsatisfied, sexually, love, social status. She cannot find satisfaction.
When Mia had the idea, I'm sure Mia knew that the part would be right for her. Physically, she was perfect. The age was right, she had the beauty, she had the appeal, and she had the technique for whatever was going to be thrown at her. It was an adventure for Mia to do it.
She fought with her sexual lust for Stanley and tried to resist it. And she tried to maintain that ideal of a genteel ruling class. And that really gave depth to the tragedy.
It's very surprising that a ballet company was doing all this sensual, sexual things in order to tell the story.
Frederick Franklin never danced the way he did last night. The role of Stanley suited him perfectly, offering the frank brutishness of the character in terms of a lunging ferocity of grace and a brooding undercurrent of menace. Miji Slavenska was incredible in the power of characterization she gave the troubled heroine. The moments of calm, courtly prudery suddenly offset by seizures of savage desire. I had the feeling last night that only ballet could express the unexpressible lurkings in the corners and crevices of Mr. Williams' play.
But the only critic that mattered to my mother was the one who knew Blanche Dubois best.
At the opening night, Tennessee Williams came to my dressing room and told me personally that I'm his best Blanche.
Magazine reported that in Manhattan last week, the biggest crowds were piling in to see George Balanchine's New York City Ballet. The hit of the week, nonetheless, was a steamy ballet treatment of A Streetcar Named Desire. John Martin writes in the New York Times that the Slavenska Franklin Ballet made a conquest of Japan. Met at the airport by a delegation armed with flowers, they were continuously pelted with blossoms and confetti through a parade through the streets of Tokyo, and greeted on stage and in the press with enthusiasm.
While the thunderous applause and brilliant notices followed us wherever we went, the company was slowly sinking financially. We couldn't make enough money to cover the company's expenses. At home, Court pored over the numbers and desperately tried to keep us afloat using the entertainment tax and then our savings to make ends meet. I had been successful with my smaller troupe for 10 years, but I wanted a larger company that could make an artistic statement. Čorak came to our performances again and again. We were hopeful that he would take us under his wing, but he had already signed Agnes de Mille.
We didn't make any money and didn't work. I remember on a snowy Christmas morning, I said, Čorak, come on. We went knocking on doors, asking, we knew some wealthy people. We'd knock on the doors and ask for money because we didn't have the payroll.
If we would have had funding, we would have pulled through and this company could have continued. This way, it just had to give up.
No one could have succeeded under those terms. You've got to have the money bags there to cushion the fall.
You had Fleischmann backing Ballet Russe, Rockefeller money backed the Cuevas company. Ballet Theatre always had Lucia Chase's personal fortune. Mia had no one.
The amazing thing is they made it work for as long as they did. The sad thing is that it almost took the shirts off their back.
The IRS took everything. We left our home with only a couple of suitcases, Maria and our dog Alexander, and moved in with friends. And like a couple of teenagers, we had to start all over again. To keep going, we sold Streetcar to Ballet Theatre. I forced myself to attend Ballet Theatre's premiere, which Valerie danced. At the intermission, Nora Kay spotted me. She was very unhappy with the role of Blanche, and in particular the costumes. "How did you manage with all those skirts?" she asked me. "That's got to go. I'm having them cut off tomorrow." Yes, the drapery did go the very next day. And with it went Blanche's fantasy. Her very vulnerability was shrouded in that drapery. Without it, she was just another nymphomaniac.
I think it was the kind of ballet, this sounds awful to say, but it was made for two people. And the two people did it, and that was it. The signatures were on the piece.
Shortly before ballet theatre was to take possession, the scenery burned in a fire that started in our garage.
I remember being awakened by the sirens. I ran through the house looking for my mother, and then I saw her. She was standing at the back door, silhouetted by the fire, just watching the flames. The Slavenska Franklin Ballet gave its last performance in 1954. Franklin and my mother went their separate ways. They never danced together again. For 16 years, my mother had toured across the country, and all of that work had borne fruit. My mother and her émigré colleagues had created an audience for ballet and had prepared America's cultural soil for something new.
Mija was part of a tradition that really began in the early 20th century. That was about narrative, that was about character, a warm and expressive style of performing, and about the power of the individual dancer to impose him or herself on the role. That tradition came to an end in the early 1950s. The shift was to a form that eventually would be considered highly American. It was closely associated with George Balanchine, with his New York City Ballet. These works that he created were modern, were set to contemporary composers, where Balanchine seemed to go beyond anything that Petipa or anyone else in the 20th century had actually imagined.
The old and the new traditions met for a brief moment when my mother danced with the young, rising New York City Ballet star, Edward Villela.
When I danced with Mija, it was historic. I had this great pleasure, this great good fortune to be dancing with an icon of that period, of that manner, of that style. And it gave me broad insight into where we all came from, who were the parents of neoclassicism.
My mother's name still drew audiences, and she made a living during these years doing television and stage guest appearances.
Ladies and gentlemen, the prima ballerina, Miji Slavenska.
But after 7 years, she had had enough.
I was 47 years old when I decided to retire, and believe me, at the height of my technical power. But where am I going to do it? I had no company. So I decided, rather than having them tell me, don't call us, we'll call you, I better tell them that I am retiring. That's how it goes.
My mother spent 40 years, almost half of her life, teaching.
In the early 60s, I asked around who was a good teacher for modern dancers. Somebody said, go and watch Mia's class. And I went, and lo and behold, it was full of many, many of the important modern dancers. From the Judson Church, Meredith Monk, Steve Paxton, Deborah Hay, Judith Dunn. Her classes were jam-packed.
My mother became a respected teacher for both modern and classical dancers. But as the decades passed, the dance world remembered Miji Slavenska, the artist, less and less.
I had known Mija in Los Angeles, where no one really understood who she was or what her career had been. She was working with young students who had never seen the Ballet Russe, didn't know anything about it.
For over 20 years, my mother struggled to escape obscurity. When she wasn't teaching, she devoted all of her time to her memoirs.
And one day, a manuscript arrived, and it was from Miji Slavenska. And then the phone rang one night, and this began a long series of late-night phone calls. It was hard for her to face the loss of so many things: her career, the family. Kurt had died, Maria had left. One of the things I felt very strongly was her need for love, that she had to be told, almost as though she had to be held, even if just by a voice.
When my mother died in 2002, her memoirs remained unpublished. She believed that she was completely forgotten in America and in her native land of Croatia. I promised my mother that I would tell her story. And that's what brought me here, where I've made the most remarkable discovery. Not so long ago, Croatia won the independence my grandfather had dreamed of. Now, they're reclaiming their lost artists. The theater that once had turned my mother away produced a streetcar named Desire in her honor, and made a gift of a gravesite in the oldest, most beautiful part of Mirogoj Cemetery.
It's your mom, you cry, but I cry too. In Russia, when Nureyev left, when Makarova escaped, when Baryshnikov jumped over, there was scratch from the books. The photo was scratched from everywhere, so maybe it was the principle also here. And the people who stay here maybe remember her, but they never spoke loud about her. We have the pictures.
And so, after 70 years, my mother had come home. Most in Croatia never saw her dance. That was America's good fortune. But it's Croatia who chooses to remember her. Her hometown put a plaque on the house where she was born. Every other year, Croatia holds an international dance competition in my mother's name. And in the ballet schools, the students hear the tale of a young Croat dancer who went west and became one of the greatest ballerinas of her time. My mother believed that she had been forgotten. I believed her story didn't matter. But I've discovered both of us were wrong.